Hello, and welcome to Page and Screen with John Paul Sarni. My guest on the program today is a novelist, editor, and scholar with degrees from Princeton, Oxford, and Columbia. After 4 novels and writing and editing the work of W.H. Auden, she turned her attention to 4 volumes of diaries from the British writer Christopher Isherwood, as well as a volume of letters between Isherwood and his life partner, Don McCarty. She has brought all of this work to a head in the epic new work that the Boston Globe has called Definitive Widescreen Biography. The book is Christopher Isherwood Inside Out, and its author and my guest today is Katherine Bucknell. Welcome.
Hi there.
Hi.
Nice to be here.
Nice to have you. It's so nice to have you visiting the studio. So you're here in California for a little bit. You were at the Huntington last night in Pasadena. You're making the rounds. You have quite an ambitious book tour for this title.
Well, I'm on the road for Christopher Isherwood. I spent 10 years writing this book, and I feel I need to nestle down into it and be in the moment and take it out to as many readers as possible.
Amazing. Now, a lot of people might not know that they do know who Christopher Isherwood is, because, and let me see if I can get the story straight, because we only have half an hour. So Isherwood, British-born, lived for a few years in Berlin, where he wrote the novel in 1939, a novel called Goodbye, Berlin.
Goodbye to Berlin.
Goodbye to Berlin. In 1951, it was turned into a play, I Am a Camera, by John Van Druten, who wrote a play that I love called I Remember Mama. And then in 1955, it was turned into a film. And then 1966, it made its way onto the Broadway stage as Cabaret. I think I have those timelines right.
Yeah, well done.
And then it became a film again in 1972, starring Liza Minnelli. And then, to my count, at least, there are 2 milestone productions of Cabaret. Once in 1998 at Studio 54 in New York City, starring Alan Cumming. And then more recently in London, and then later on Broadway at the, quote, the Kit Kat Club with Eddie Redmayne and Jessie Buckley, and a rotating cast of incredible performers. It's a remarkable production that I've actually seen 2 or 3 times now. So people do know who Isherwood is, if not least for this, because they know Cabaret. And Cabaret, I think you pointed out, is performed constantly.
It's on stage somewhere in the world every day.
Yeah.
And I think it's particularly relevant to kids now. I mean, it's reinterpreted with every new production. There's always a change up. But this world of, rising tyranny and hedonism in the face of that, and the kind of defiance that we're going to have a good time.
Mm-hmm.
I think that never gets old. I think the current productions are very emphasizing something that is very much there in Isherwood's book about if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem, or in fact, you are probably both, no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
There's been a big turn towards that, understanding of how we're all responsible for what takes place politically.
Yes, and especially now in these months leading up to the American election. So, well, let's begin. So, at the beginning, I mean, this is very much a sweeping cradle to grave and even beyond, biography. So, we're starting with Isherwood basically in the English countryside during, World War I outside of London. And there are amazing chapters about his life and in Berlin and Hollywood. But he starts off as you say, landed gentry, right? He's living on a country estate with his family. He has a library of 1,500 books. He has a childhood that feels very much like it's straight out of Downton Abbey. So a lot of privilege there, and but also a lot of knowledge and interest in literature from all over the world.
Yes, well, he was an insider by birth, and had all the privilege and prestige that allowed him to get, educated and go anywhere he wanted to. But he was never comfortable with that inside position. He was sent to British public school, which is sort of training ground for the empire. He lost his father to the empire in World War I. And he was uncomfortable with his background. And his generation, he and Auden and other age mates, they took literature from the kind of ideals of high modernism, Bloomsbury, the country house, whatever, to the left, to the working class, to the margins in the 1930s. So yes, Downton Abbey is definitely, but this is the true story. His country house background is real, and there's a lot of really important detail of the first 10 years of his life that plays out in the later years.
And even from that age, from such a young age, he and his mother both were these incredible diarists. They seem to have written everything down. They were also collecting like memory books and like newspaper books, and so they really archived, the life of this family, which is, I presume, was a huge amount of the 10 years of your work is coalescing all of this together. Uh, why were they so fascinated with putting everything down on paper and recording everything?
Oh, well, first of all, they were very clever, and very observant. There was also a lot of painting going on. His mother and father were both painters. His father was a professional painter. Um, the, his mother started keeping diaries, as so many people do, when she was a teenager, and I'd say maybe her first little love affair, that she wasn't going to then report to her mother what was going on, so she wrote it down in her diary.
Mm.
And they got this habit of recording and reflecting as time passes in life. I think many people kept diaries, but with the level of intelligence, the detail is so vivid. And even though his mother wasn't very well educated, her diary is extraordinary. And she kept it from the 90s until 1958. So there were
Wow.
thousands of pages to read. And he certainly got the habit first from her.
Hmm.
And they were collaborators in his, boyhood. They wrote stories together. But then as he got older, he wanted to tell his own story. And so in some ways they became rivals.
And a lot of what he wrote in his diaries, as you point out, you sort of fly us into the future. Say, there's a moment that happens in his personal life, and we'll see this later in this novel or in this play. A lot of his personal life, and particularly his childhood, seems to land in his work. A lot of it seems very autobiographical. It's some of the shapes and names change a bit, but there's a lot of himself in all of this. It wasn't fantasy by any means.
No, I mean, I was writing a biography of a man who used himself in his work all the time. So how could I add to that? I wanted to give a narrative that gave the trajectory of the whole life,
Mm.
and I believe there is a kind of internal kind of moral direction to his life, and that the only way to the way to see that is to tell the whole joined up story and put in as much detail as possible. He was always seeking meaning, and so the reader can experience that in the book. Um, it's he was he was a very religious person,
Mm.
and very cynical in the 30s and 40s. In his youth, he left the Christian religion, and then he converted to Hinduism in 1939. And just always thinking about what do things mean. So, you could write a story which is just a list of I went here, I went there. I don't think that's very interesting.
Mm.
And for a person who's reflecting constantly on his own life, I wanted to show that interior world and how he continued to reshape his life based on, he would consider, well, we write everything down, like here's what I'm doing and how's it going, and examining that would make adjustments to try to have a better, more fulfilling, more successful, happier life.
Mhm. And while he was sorting all of this out and trying to figure out who he is, as a lot of people do, as the formative years, as you're kind of going into university, he did that. He went to Cambridge briefly. And, he had a lot of friends around him who were maybe he was starting to see both himself in them and get a sense as to who his tribe was. But I think it's a friend of his who put it in the book. It's a brilliant name. You refer to it as the poshocracy.
Oh, yeah.
This group of people around him. So what are those those formative years like? Because he tinkers with different things. He thinks about maybe going into medicine and maybe studying history, and then he picks things up and he puts things down. But who is this group of people that are around him? Because a lot of them really came up together and are literary giants in their own right.
Well, Edward Upward, his friend from Repton, and then again at Cambridge University, was a communist. He was a rebel at school, always right from the beginning as a teenager, and a kind of Byronic figure in Isherwood's portrayal of him. W.H. Auden Isherwood met even before he met Edward Upward, when they were at boarding prep school, which in England they go at 8, 9 years old. Isherwood went when he was 10. Auden went when he was 8. And they slept in the same dormitory. So, there were like 6 or 8 boys sleeping in a room it was Isherwood's last year. So that's a very intimate shared life as boys. And then they fell out of touch because they went to different senior schools, and then they met again when Auden was 18 and Isherwood was about 20. And they then became lifelong friends. Isherwood said, we're two of a kind. They were had such similar background and so many. There were differences, but a lot of shared understanding of personality and family relationships and so on. Isherwood wrote this wonderful book, Lions and Shadows, about his education in the 20s. It's very funny, and it covers his school years and his years at Cambridge. I think he felt that his education and upbringing was guiding him in a kind of robotic way towards a pre-planned life that other people were deciding how he should live. At first, he was going to be sent to a school to prepare him for the army. Then his parents realized he was not the military type, and his mother decided he should be a librarian. So he studied, academic history at Repton and then at Cambridge, and he decided to flunk out of Cambridge on purpose because he just had to spring himself from this trap. He wanted to write for the movies. He started going to the movies when he was 8 years old. He lived in Limerick in Ireland. And he was obsessed with the movies. And after he flunked out of Cambridge, he tried to get a job with Oswald Stoll, who was the biggest movie maker in England at that time. Didn't get it, and so he tried medical school, and but all the while he was writing stories.
Yeah. And at the beginning, when he first tried to get a job in Hollywood, I think he was living in London at the time, if I remember correctly. And I think you write in the book that he threw himself at London. He's 18 and a half years old, and he very much seemed to want to live. He was a lot of his writing really comes from, so many of these experiences, both in London and then shortly thereafter, moving to Berlin. And this is not too long after World War One. And his father died in World War One, so it's a particular choice. But this is now almost, I guess, 100 years ago. But as he does this, as he goes out into the world in London and then Berlin, he really is, embracing his sexuality in a way that is perhaps surprising, to read about now so far on, because he seemed so confident in himself, and he knew who he was and what he wanted, and wanted to experience all these things. So what was that impetus to go to, Berlin in the first place? What pulled him there?
Well, when he was at Cambridge, he had a kind of inner crisis about his sexuality. He had an uncle who was gay. I think he was aware from school age that he liked boys, but he also flirted with girls as a teenager. And he had this extended period of time where he was the sort of model son and, looked like he was going to do everything his family asked of him. When he was at Cambridge, he later recalled that was the first time he ever got into bed with someone, but I think it was quite short and awkward. And He read biography of Oscar Wilde that I think was a kind of turning point for him, because he thought, I don't want my life to turn out that way. I want to survive. I'm not going to stay. Oscar Wilde, uh, when he lost the libel case, and the police were coming around, his friend said, we've got a steam yacht for you in the Thames. You can get away, go to France. His wife wanted him to get away, and Wilde insisted on staying and standing trial, and so went to prison. And Isherwood, having lost his father in the war, for his whole generation, the World War I was a time of sacrifice and sorrow and grief, and so many people died. And so you say, he wanted to have fun. There was just welling up in him all the time this idea, I want to have a life. I don't want to miss everything. I don't want to make all these sacrifices. And the empire, to that generation, I think, it had sort of perpetrated this trick, go and die for your country. And they saw boys just a little older than them. He was too young to fight in the war, dying. His cousins died. His father died. So he did want to get away and have fun. And Auden, who was actually a couple years younger, went to Berlin to learn German, and wrote back to Isherwood saying, there are all these brothels here. The police don't really control anything. You've got to come. And so he went really to join Auden there, having heard the tales of sexual freedom. And I think going to a foreign country, he felt much freer than he did at home. And so these were huge things to do. He was ill before he got on the train to Berlin. He had like a temperature, but he was determined to break out, and off he went.
Well, it's also so, when you look at it in a biography like this, it's so interesting to look at this tight time frame between the two world wars. And, there's this period of respite, but then I think you write in the book that as he's arriving in Berlin, one of his roommates is a Nazi, and there's an election, and then all of a sudden the Nazis are really coming into power. But at the same time, there is this sort of freedom and sexual liberation and all of that. I mean, it's amazing that if you look at things like Cabaret, you can sort of see all those characters, which is amazing. Was there a real life Sally Bowles? Was there someone who inspired the character of Sally Bowles?
Yes. Sally Bowles is based on a young woman he met in Berlin called Jean Ross, who was trying to be an actress and a singer. She couldn't sing like Liza Minnelli. And
few can.
Yeah. Isherwood said if she could have sung like that, all of Europe would have been there to hear her. There also, Sally Bowles is not based only on Jean Ross. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the other models for this character. With Isherwood, there are always literary models as well as real life ones, and he always mixes in others. So she reaches back to many other characters in literature, to a Ziegfeld Follies girl called Sally, who he'd seen in the musical called Sally, which he'd seen in 1921 in London. A girl who meets her prince in disguise who's washing dishes. And of course, in his story, she doesn't ever get the prince. And then in Sally, there is a lot of himself, and she is his boy-girl alter ego. And so she's there in Berlin, sleeping her way to nowhere, which is exactly what he was doing.
Right.
And actually, he named her Sally Jackson Bowles. She had jettisoned the name Jackson, but Bowles was actually a family name in the Isherwood family. It was a name of a cousin. So there's a little clue there.
Well, I think it's remarkable, and after all of that goes on in Germany, is it 1939 when he sort of starts to pack up in Berlin?
No, it's much earlier than that. And actually, when given time to sit down and read that book carefully, Goodbye to Berlin, he was there from 1929 to 1933. So Hitler took power in 1933, and the big turning point, the Reichstag fire. Isherwood stayed until May 1933, so just 10 days after the burning of the books in the Opera Square,
Wow.
when Goebbels threw, they started this fire and Goebbels started throwing just the sort of books Isherwood was trying to write, leftist books, books by communists, books by intellectuals, books by Jews, and all the library of Magnus Hirschfeld, who ran the Institute for Sexual Science, where Isherwood had lived in the annex to his building, but also a man he looked up to who was a sexual reformer and who was offering advice and legal counseling and ran a VD clinic and was the sort of really progressive, forward energy in the sexual scene in Berlin to try to reform the German penal code. And Hirschfeld's bust was carried in on a pike and thrown on the fire. So Isherwood was there to see that. And 10 days later, he left and took his German boyfriend with him. And lots of people by then, of course, were fleeing Berlin and Germany because all these civil freedoms were being suspended and people were being thrown in jail and tortured if they were on the left. He wrote the stories mostly after leaving Berlin, and they were published in bits and pieces in a magazine called New Writing. And then the book, he shaped it into a book, which was published in 1939. So Berlin had been, as it were, gone from his point of view. His Weimar Berlin, the Berlin of, post-World War I, Berlin was this capital of freedom and new cultural trends, art, music, writing, and that all just ended in the spring of 1933 when Hitler took over. And so he's saying goodbye to something that had looked like a kind of mecca for the new, and had been gone for a few years by the time he published the book.
And he thinks that maybe the new mecca for the new is the United States and the American West, eventually to California. And he talks about, when he gets there, talking about, he wrote to his mother, I think you wrote in the book, about seeing the sun and how wonderful the sun was.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's amazing. It does feel like a little bit of a sort of a Hollywood dream. So what was that push? What was it always to go to Hollywood because he wanted to work in film? Was it just that
after
inciting...
he left Berlin, so he'd published a couple of novels, and in one of them there is an attempted suicide, and a Viennese film director who was also a refugee, Bertold Viertel, hired him to work on a script in London in 1933-34. It's a film called Little Friend. It's an adaptation of a Viennese novel. It's a wonderful film, sort of forgotten. Anyway, he made that film with Bertold Viertel, 33-34. And Viertel actually had a career in Hollywood, and his wife was already living there, and she worked with Greta Garbo and wrote scripts for her. So many things happened in Isherwood's life between 33 and 39. He was trying to find a new homeland with his German boyfriend. He traveled all over Europe, lived in a lot of different places. But he went to China with Auden. And on the way home from China, they stopped in New York, and they thought, right, we don't believe this, politics is breaking down. We've failed to change the world with our writing. We need to go away, be anonymous, start over again as artists. We don't want to be these political leaders of the left. They'd been writing leftist plays. They'd become too famous to be able to still be creative, and also being gay and being that famous was a big problem in a small country like England, where everyone knows everyone and everyone's related in their social class. So they decided to settle in New York. Isherwood wasn't happy there. He hated the city life, and
their work wasn't really known there, right?
Not so much.
Yeah.
No, not yet. They were published, but they were not very well known. He went out to Hollywood. Viertel showed up there shortly after Isherwood arrived to, settle back in with his family. And he and Isherwood worked on a couple of movie ideas together, including Isherwood sold one of his novels, Mr. Norris Changes Trains, which is set in Berlin. He sold that to Samuel Goldwyn. Finally, Selke Viertel got him a studio job. I mean, he had this job with Goldwyn. It didn't really work out. And she got him a job on Rage in Heaven, and then he was off. Once you had a studio job, you kept getting another studio job, and these were. He was known as a dialogue specialist in the beginning, and he would be hired in to do bits and pieces on scripts and paid a big weekly salary. And for the rest of his life, really, he worked on and off in the studios to pay for being a novelist.
Mm. And one of his stories that we've obviously mentioned Cabaret, but one of his stories that was adapted into a film was or his novels was A Single Man, which was so beautifully done. It was made in 2009. It was Tom Ford's directorial debut. And now, was that also autobiographical, A Single Man?
Well, yes and no. I think he always drew on personal experience in his work. George, the main character, is and is not him. He had this incredible detachment as an artist that he could, get outside his own head and look at what he wanted to use. He'd also, as a Hindu, practiced non-attachment for years, and he had a lot of interest in how the unconscious mind works and the connection between the brain and the body, and all of these things are being brought into this one day in the life of this character George, who is a gay Englishman teaching literature at a Southern Californian university. So obviously all those facts line up with
Right.
Christopher Isherwood, the real man. There are many things about Christopher Isherwood that are not in that book.
Mm.
But what is in there is very much based on himself.
And now, as part of your research, obviously you read all of his work and his diaries and things, but then as you go through and you talk about all the things that were those influences on him and trying to decipher what comes from where, did you have a huge reading pile over these years when you were writing this book to see what he was reading at the time? Was it a huge syllabus?
Yeah, I had a huge reading pile, and I did try to read whatever he was reading, but obviously I couldn't read everything he
Right.
read. So I looked for clues, if he talked about a book. Sometimes I found enormous debts that they were so big that he didn't even write about them. So, for example, E.M. Forster, he talked about how Forster was his literary master, and they were very close friends, and it was an incredibly long-lasting and beautiful friendship. But some of his biggest debts to Forster are, in a way, unacknowledged. And so it's by reading the books alongside one another, you find that he's in conversation, with Forster, with Gide. Virginia Woolf, huge influence on him. He sort of tried to ignore her for a long time. But if you read her work and you read his work, you find it there. James Joyce, some things about Joyce he really didn't like, but in A Single Man, it's one day in the life, and we start out on the toilet, so it's a lot like Leopold Bloom in Ulysses. He read all the time, and he read the classic works of the canon as it was then, and then he read complete junk, and he had no he didn't have any snobbery about that. He'd read anything, and he would use whatever was useful to him.
Mm. Well, no, it's really remarkable, and as I told you just before we started, Catherine, I've been working on my own reading list based on some of the things that he was reading just for fun. But still, you have to tell me, because you've spent now so much time with Isherwood on paper and working with his material, not just on this book but the previous diaries. What pulled you into his orbit so fully that you have decided to commit such a huge part of your life to his work? Was it some of his writing? Was it his story? What brought you into him?
In some ways, it was Don Bachardy.
Mm.
When I met Don, I still just remember so well the very first day I met him and went to the house where he lived with Isherwood and where he still lives. Don is an extraordinary man. He's incredibly charming, incredibly intelligent, and the house is amazing and filled with art and filled with sunlight. So I walked in there and thought, wow, this is something I didn't know about. It's so
Mm.
beautiful. How is this possible? What makes this? And their story, the more I learned, the more interested I became. And being straight, being a woman, being married, this opportunity to enter the world of two gay men and to find out how they lived. I mean, maybe I was on some pathway that I wanted to be, I was studying literature and I was going to be, a critic, literary critic, historian of some kind, that I could have written maybe about Edith Wharton or Emily Bronte. But suddenly here was something really intriguing. And the days when I started in the 90s, a lot of this world was very secret, very hidden. So the sort of opportunity to decode or crack a mystery, I wanted to find out more.
Mm.
And it has never ceased to interest me. I'm more interested in him now than even when I began working on
Wow.
him. And it's for his work, but also for the way he lived his life. This determination to find his own pathway, to keep thinking, who am I and what do I need to try to be? I think this is a great example for all people to try to understand themselves and what is their vocation, and how can they make a contribution, and what is the meaning of their life,
Mm.
not to just robotically do what the corporate institutional world kind of how it slots you. He was an individual in a kind of a mass society. And I find that very exciting and, a wonderful example.
That's amazing. I think that's the perfect reason to do it. So there's so much more in the book, and obviously we can't talk about it all, but I hope that people will go find it. The book is Christopher Isherwood, Inside Out. Katherine Bucknell has been with me today, so thank you so much for being here. Before you leave, though, I have to ask you the question that I ask everyone who comes by, which is, in your neighborhood, what is your favorite independent bookstore to go get your books when you can fill up a tote bag and go on holiday?
Well, I have two in my neighborhood. I have Daunt's if I go south, and I have Legends and Rubenstein if I go east. And
Mm.
they're equidistant, and they're both have that wonderful smell of books that makes me hunker down and say, relax,
Yeah.
get into a book, and just stay there for a while.
And Daunt's is amazing because Daunt's has all in the back room. They have everything organized by country, so you can, if you want a book that's set in South Africa or Italy, you can go find it that way. So yeah, it's one of my favorite spots too. Well, amazing, Katherine. Thank you so much for coming by the podcast. It was
Thank
so wonderful
you.
to chat with you, and congratulations on the book. And if people want to find out more about it, we'll put up your Instagram, and then also on your website, there's a list of all the places people can go see you on this book tour.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Really fun to talk to you.
Thank you. See you soon.